This lesson is on solving quadratic equations by using square roots. Some quadratic equations cannot easily be solved by factoring, so what you're going to be working with in this lesson is square roots that can be used to solve some of these quadratic equations. Here in a minute I'm going to pull up some examples of working with square roots, and this is what it looks like. So when you think of something like 3 times 3 or 3 squared, that equals 9. To undo that 9, I call it, you can take the square root of 9, and the square root of 9 is going to be 3. Here in these notes it says positive square root of 9, so just be cautious when you're working with positives and negatives here with square roots. The second example here, we have negative 3 times negative 3, or negative 3 squared. Remember, negative times negative is going to give me a positive 9. And if we take the square root of 9, but we could put a negative in front of it, that would be negative 3, so negative square root of 9. So you can have here, your answer could be plus minus 3, because 3 times 3 equals 9, and negative 3 times negative 3 equals 9. So when you have 9, the square root of 9, your answer is going to say, we call it plus minus 3, because of what I just showed you with 3 times 3 is 9, or negative 3 times negative 3. Also something to think about here, when you take the square root of a positive number and the sign of the square root is not indicated, you must find both the positive and the negative square root, and it's shown here as well with the plus minus square root of 9, so you'd get plus minus 3, positive and negative 3. So you must find the positive and the negative square root. Here's a chart showing the square root property, and the word definition of this is to solve a square root equation in the form x squared equals a. You take the square root of both sides. So here we have x squared equals 15. So what we do to get rid of that, to undo the x squared, you take the square root of the left, but whatever you do to one side, you have to do the other, so you take the square root of the right side. So taking the square root of x squared and square root of 15, you're going to get x equals plus or minus square root of 15. If x squared equals a, and a is a positive real number, then x is going to equal the plus minus square root of a. Let's look at an example here. It says solve using square roots and then check your answer. We have here x squared equals 121. So what we first have to do is take the square root of each side. So we take the square root of x squared, square root of 121. And what you'll notice is you'll get x equals plus minus 11. So that will be your answer. We can check this by plugging in 11 for x and negative 11 for x. So 11 squared is 121. 121 does equal, the left and the right side equal one another. Negative 11 squared, negative 11 times negative 11 is 121, so that works itself out too. So the solutions for example A are going to be 11 and negative 11. For B here, we have x squared equals 0, so you take the square root of both sides. The square root of 0 is just 0, so x is going to equal plus or minus the square root of 0. So my solution here is x equals 0. And what we do is we just substitute 0 in for x. 0 squared is 0. The left and the right side equal one another, so that's the solution is correct, being 0. Here we have x squared equals negative 16, so we take the square root of both sides to get rid of the x squared. Notice with this problem there is a negative in front of 16. For this, it says x equals plus or minus the square root of 16, but you really cannot have a negative sign inside of the square root symbol. So for this particular question, there's going to be no real numbers whose square is negative. So for this one, we say that there is no real solution. If you had minus the square root of 16, the negative sign outside the square root, then that would equal plus minus 4, but that negative sign is inside the square root symbol, so we cannot, that would be a no solution, because you can't take the square root of a negative value. Moving on to examples 2, it says here solve using square roots and check your answer. Here we have a little bit more involved equations, but don't let that get you too confused because it's still the same idea as the previous slide. Here we have 100x squared plus 49 equals 0. So what we're first going to do is we're going to subtract 49 to both sides. So what we're left with is 100x squared equals negative 49. We then are going to divide 100 to both sides. So what we get is x equals negative 49 over 100. We need to get rid of the x squared, so you take the square root of both sides. Since there's a negative in front of the 49, there can be no real number whose square is going to be negative. So x cannot equal the square root of 49 over 100. So for this particular question, that would be no real solution. Now, if this 49 did not have a negative sign in front of it, then you could have taken the square root, and it would have been 7 over 10, and that would have been a solution. For B, we have here x minus 5 squared equals 16. We first need to get rid of the square here, so we take the square root of both sides. So square root of x minus 5, square root of 16. When you take the square root with this squared here, it undoes the square. So what you're left with is x minus 5, and then square root of 16 is plus minus 4. So what you have now is x minus 5 equals plus or minus 4. And so then what you do is you set it, since it's plus minus 4, you set x minus 5 equal to 4 and x minus 5 equal to negative 4, and then you solve for x. So here, the first one will add 5 to each side. Along with the second one, you add 5. So what you're left with is x equals 9 or x equals 1. And those are your solutions. To check it, you would substitute it back in to make sure both sides are equal to 16. Example 3, solve, and you're going to round to the nearest hundredth. So you have 0 equals 90 minus x squared. So the first thing is you're going to add, you want to get rid of this minus x squared, you're going to add x squared to both sides. So what you're left with is x squared equals 90. We want to take the square root of x squared to get x by itself, so square root each side. So you get x equals plus or minus the square root of 90, which simplifies to x equals plus or minus 9.49. So my solutions are 9.49, positive 9.49, and negative 9.49. The next one here we have 2x squared minus 64 equals 0. First you want to add 64 to both sides. So what you're left with is 2x squared equals 64. Then you're going to divide 2 to each side to get x squared equals 32. You then take the square root of each side. So what you're left with is x equals plus or minus the square root of 32, which simplifies to plus or minus 5.66. So your solutions are 5.66 and negative 5.66. And that is it for this lesson.